Hi, this is Paul. This morning I was watching and very much enjoying Jonathan Pageau's newest video about symbolism and the beasts of the Book of Revelation, and it's a very interesting video. Watching him manage the preterist, a lot of the Book of Revelation is incredibly fraught with all sorts of naughty conceptual approaches to figuring out, does the book of Revelation talk about what happened in the Roman Empire? Does the book of Revelation talk about what's happening only in the future? And Jonathan uses his symbolism to sort of branch that, and that's not uncommon in my tradition. In my tradition, there was sort of a soft, well, it did speak about the Roman Empire, but it also speaks about the future, and so I had a very similar approach to that. But I caught almost right away a comment that was voted up that said, Jonathan is such a blessing, just incredible. Why isn't teaching like this happening in church? And I thought that was a comment that has been a central part of my whole journey on YouTube when seeing Jordan Peterson, noticing that in many ways Jordan Peterson's outperforming churches, and trying to get my head around that. So I had a little series of tweets this morning on this. This comment caught my eye. It applies not just to Jonathan's ancient contemporary groundbreaking work. As I've said before, I hear it applied all over the place, from woke to anti-woke to anti-COVID to anything people feel activistic about. Part of what's happened in our culture is that we have tried to define religion in a particular way, either something that has to do with the supernatural, something that has to do with the Bible, something in that vein. But that's actually a rather poor way to define religious. Your religion could be the thing that you act out. It could be the thing, especially, that you get activistic about. And you might say, well, I'm an activist about such and such a thing, justice or liberty or one of these things in the secular frame. Well, that sort of becomes your secularized religion. It's in sort of the sociological definition, the matter of your utmost concern. I went on to comment about that phrase. This is, in a way, the Protestantification that has been moving since the 16th century. It's very hard to not be a small p Protestant, even if you're an atheist, a Roman Catholic, or someone who identifies with another established religion. Now, what do I mean by Protestant in that way? Part of what happens in the Protestant Reformation is that the Christian faith is, on one hand, deeply psychologized, but also very much spreads out across the secular space in a different way than it was in the medieval Roman Church. What do I mean by that? John Calvin, for example, wanted to establish in Geneva a holy city. Well, how does that work? And in the past, I've made comments on Charles Taylor's one-speed versus two-speed religion. There's, in a sense, in a two-speed religion, the super saints who are in the monastery and all the regular people who are out there in the world. Luther wanted to have the priesthood of all believers, so it's sort of flattening it out. And John Calvin, I should grab that book off the shelf. This book's been out quite a few years. It was written, John Calvin, The Constructive Revolutionary, 1970. And it goes into the ways in which Calvin and his followers, you see this in the Puritans. I've been talking a lot about the Puritans in North America, their attempt to create a holy city, their attempt to create a holy society. And it doesn't mean that the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox didn't, but they went about this in different ways. And part of that has to do with the role of the church. So part of what I've been thinking, really from the start, talking, meeting Jonathan Pageau, following his channel, talking to him, thinking about Roman Catholic versus Protestant. If you look at the ways that Protestant churches work, most Protestant churches now, do a lot of singing, and music and congregational singing became a very big part of the Protestant Reformation and a very big part of Protestant churches. And of course, it also goes on in Roman Catholic churches. But in terms of how the service flows, what the center of the service is, in some ways, music is used as a psychedelic for everyone, I think. But it's sort of a way to, and this has really become strong in seeker churches, Hillsong churches, Pentecostal churches. Paul Anleitner, who is on this channel often, is a worship pastor, and we've had a fair number of musicians, and so what's supposed to happen is that the worship in the church lifts you out of your body into the heavenlies for a little while. And if you listen to my conversation with Vin Armani, in some ways that sort of runs a similar purpose as the psychedelics. A cathedral does a similar thing, but with architecture. You walk into a cathedral and you're just sort of in awe. Relics have a sense of doing this. I mean, many of these things are religious ways of delivering a religious experience, a powerful spiritual experience. And so what happened in Protestant churches is that you have the music, and then you also have the teaching. And so this, Jonathan is such a blessing, just incredible. Why isn't teaching like this happening in a church? Generally speaking, in Orthodox and Roman Catholic church services, there's the teaching doesn't quite have the same impact. Now, I've got to be really careful with this because obviously there's a long history in the Christian church. You can look at Augustine's sermon, Chrysostom's sermons, John Calvin's sermons. And so that there's always been teaching in the church. But if you look at, let's say, Protestant versus sacramental churches today, in a Protestant church, black service, new restless and reformed service, you'll have 45-minute, hour-long sermons. When my grandparents were my age and my father was in his 20s, you could go into Christian Reformed churches and have hour-long sermons. In many mainline and Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches, the emphasis is much more on the liturgy and the sacrament. Even Jonathan Pageau comments that part of the strategy of the Orthodox service is to, in some ways, relieve the necessity of having an outstanding preacher in every church, because you're leaning on the divine liturgy and the liturgy to sort of carry the church along and form the church and do all of that work. And I'm not critiquing or criticizing any of that. I'm simply showing the different strategies that the different traditions of churches use to attempt to form the people. And also, I mean, in John Calvin's Geneva, the pastor working closely with the civil authorities to bring about a holy city out of Geneva. Now this will obviously, as the Protestant Reformation develops, this will split up. And when you get to America, Roger Williams, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, the Quakers, a number of English dissenters, just by virtue of not always having to police people and their spirituality, and especially their moral lives, which can become a very onerous duty. Peterson often notes that Pageau noted that any system that requires a lot of costly policing will in many ways underperform systems that require less policing, because there's just a high degree of cost and energy, social cost and energy, that goes into moral policing. You see this in China. We might be nervous about the increase of Chinese military power. But I've heard, and I don't know if it's true or not, I've heard speculation that China spends 4 times the resources on internal policing. In other words, if you really want to have a productive society, you're better off arranging it so that you don't have quite so much policing to do, because that simply takes a drain on energy and resources of the leadership. So my next tweet was about Beth Moore. Those of you who don't know who Beth Moore is, Beth Moore was a very popular woman Bible study leader in the Southern Baptist Convention. And part of what we've seen in the last 100 years is, really since the printing press, is an explosion of platforms. Because now let's imagine most of the people in your community are illiterate. Most of the wisdom gets passed on generation to generation. It isn't devoted to writing. Even in the early 20th century, in many Christian Reformed churches, the most educated person was likely the pastor. That has been changing quite steadily. And in many cases, pastors don't have as much education as, let's say, university professors that are in their midst. The Christian Reformed Church has held a rather high bar in terms of clergy training, but it's not extraordinarily high on the North American scene. Generally speaking, in the Christian Reformed Church, a Christian Reformed minister needs a 4-year bachelor degree, and then another 3 years of formal seminary education on top of that, plus another year of residency or internship, or figuring out how to spread that concurrently throughout the years. But what we've seen now, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of chatter about the women bloggers and women podcasters. And Beth Moore, in some ways, is the grandmother of this. She's, I think, 63 years old, her Wikipedia page says. And she is an enormously powerful woman in the evangelical Christian world. She's been quite dismayed by things like internet trolls and some pastors that don't necessarily agree with her on a variety of things. But if we're sort of keeping tabs on power, she's far more powerful than your average internet troll or than your average Southern Baptist pastor. Now, this gets very interesting when it comes to questions about women's ordination, because a lot of this sort of activist fight in the late 20th century in Protestant churches, especially in evangelical churches like the Christian Reformed Church, has been whether or not women are permitted to serve in all offices of the church. And I'm probably going to be speaking about this quite a bit more directly when I get around to, where are those books? When I get around to addressing these 2 books in particular. After a little dust up on Twitter, I pretty much decided that before I do interviews with authors, when publishers send me their books, I am going to first do a review of the book on my YouTube channel, so that if the author, wants to correct me, or if we want to have a debate about it, then the author will better know where I stand on the book. And in almost every book, there'll be things I like about the book and things I don't like about the book. But the question of women serving in ecclesiastical office in Protestant churches is a very different thing, partially by virtue of how Protestant churches are different from, let's say, Roman Catholic churches or Orthodox churches. There's a degree of pageantry, liturgy, and embodiment in Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches that there really isn't in terms of the theology, and the theology of the church is called ecclesiology. The ecclesiology in Protestant churches, which makes the questions of how women do or don't participate in the church differently. So then along comes Beth Moore, and Beth Moore writes Bible study, writes books. I've never read a single one of her book or looked at a single one of her Bible studies, so I'm not going to critique it one way or another. I just sort of guess it's fairly middle of the road, moderate, evangelical type stuff, of which there's tons. So how are we to assess Beth Moore's role in the church? Now, Esther O'Reilly on Twitter will tell you that, she's Anglican, and so the Anglicans sort of try to span the sacramentalists and the Protestant, it's like psychological, teaching-oriented types of church. And so all of these issues are at play here. And so Jonathan Pageau is not an ordained priest. And as some noted in responses to this Twitter thread that I made, you can find some priests in the Orthodox Church that are teaching things similar to Jonathan, but others commented that they don't hear anything like this in their Orthodox Church. And I have exactly the same reaction from many people in terms of my stuff, because they'll say, the stuff I get from you, Paul, I'm not going to find in other Protestant churches. And they're right. You will find in Protestant churches whole varieties of other kinds of teaching. There's sort of a Protestant, there's sort of what you'll find in mainline teaching, which today will usually be a whole lot about applied justice. In evangelical churches, traditionally, you'll find a lot of emphasis on soul salvation and going to heaven when you die. In this video with Ross Douthat and Tara Isabel Burton and Stephen Smith that I've done clips of, it's on my clip channel, Ross Douthat makes the comment that if Marianne Williamson had been around 100 years ago, she would have started a church. Today, she publishes books. She has an Instagram feed. I don't know if she has a YouTube channel. She has a blog. She has an organization around her. This gets into the question of Jordan Peterson and his plan, but not a church. Why not? And in some ways, part of my approach to the Jordan Peterson thing has been very church-ish in that I have emphasized small groups. But of course, it's not just churches that use small groups. Church as platform still has a degree of power that politicians and political pundits fight over. You will hear, in a highly political book like Jesus and John Wayne, there's a lot of hand-wringing about very red state, evangelical, masculine, Republican churches. There's a lot of hand-wringing about that. In the black community, it's long been the case that politics was very much a part of the black church and still is. In my neighborhood, it's not uncommon to have, black politicians running for office, and very seldom, because my church isn't very big, oh, you're a pastor, can I come to your church? Sure, but I'm not going to let you preach. What do you know? I wasn't going to preach. No, but it's not unusual to have the politician behind the pulpit on a Sunday morning given a certain degree of time. In my church service, the politician is welcome to come. The politician can sit in the seats with everyone else, and usually sort of at the middle of the service announcement prayer time, they can stand up and say a few words and be available after church to shake hands and have conversations with people, but they're not going to get a spot in the church worship service to make a political speech. That's part of sort of this division we have in the Christian Reformed Church. There's continues to be a lively debate in the Christian Reformed Church about whether or not it's appropriate to have a flag in the worship in the sanctuary, or whether or not certain songs, America the Beautiful, certain sort of nationalistic hymns should be sung in church. And the way the Christian Reformed Church has sometimes done this is that they've had other prayer day services where they'll sing other songs, or people will have those songs, but you won't find those songs in the official hymnal of the Christian Reformed Church. So church as platform for politics is a very big deal, and one that's highly contested over. But part of what we're in the middle of is a disruption of platforms with respect to churches. So Jonathan Pageau is teaching on the book of Revelation on YouTube. I have my rough drafts for Sunday on YouTube. COVID has put many preachers on YouTube and on streaming. It's interesting. I've watched some Orthodox services on YouTube, but participation in an Orthodox service via YouTube versus participation in an evangelical service via YouTube are two wholly different things. And so part of what I think we're going to continue to be thinking about are platforms and churches. And, really as a Protestant, a lot of what I continue to struggle through with on this channel and thinking about things is what ought the church to do. Now, if you're Roman Catholic or Orthodox, you pretty much stay the course because their thing is staying the course. Protestants usually sort of go all over the map, and there's are good things about that and bad things about that. But what's interesting is that since the invention of the printing press, since radio, television, you think about Bishop Barron's work on YouTube. How ought one to think about that? And of course, this isn't new because, the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church have enormously impressive traditions of theological development and church teaching. And I'm going to have to do a little bit more thinking about church history and asking the question, well, how and where did that come about? Did it come about through pulpits? What has happened to preaching in those traditions? Because, again, certainly you can go back and read the sermons of Augustine, the sermons of Chrysostom. My colleague Eric Dirksen, if you follow him on Twitter, he's always dropping little quotes from Augustine or Chrysostom or someone like that. So this is very much an issue, and it's very much an issue around Jonathan's channel and my channel. How are we to think about YouTube? Or Bishop Barron's channel? What is the place of YouTube? How are we to think about these issues with respect to the church? Jonathan Pageau, if his channel grows large enough, could in some ways be an Orthodox analog to Beth Moore. And the amount of power he would have in the church could far outweigh the power of members of the Orthodox hierarchy or priesthood. How are we to think about that? And if, let's say, somewhere down the line, there's a decision that Jonathan decides to, disagree with someone in the Orthodox Church. Churches are full of disagreement. Would he submit? Now, Protestants are, of course, known for not submitting. And in that sense, Beth Moore leaves, but you see, again, it's different in the Protestant world because it's the Southern Baptist Convention. They're not technically a denomination. There's no bishops in the Southern Baptist Convention. And this gets into a whole host of issues, again, that you can read about in George Marsden's work about the development of democracy in America and the development of churches in America with very democratic ecclesiologies. So, a whole lot of issues around this, and just a lot to think about. So I'm curious about your comments. Just put them in the comment section. Thanks for watching.